Welcome to the podcast, The Psychology of Health. Today, I'm going to talk about one of the most persistent and complicated public health debates of the last 50 years, the dramatic rise of the obesity epidemic in the United States, and our attempts to explain it using observed dietary trends. Before we begin, I want to make it clear that this podcast is simply a synthesis of research studies on various health-related topics, nothing more. Here, you'll find no twisted facts, no hype, no lies, no misinformation. My goal is to present only a clear and understandable summary of research findings, making complex scientific evidence accessible to everyone. My name is Milan Toma. I'm an associate professor at New York Institute of Technology College of Osteopathic Medicine. For decades, there has been a widely held, almost axiomatic belief that the dramatic increase in obesity across the United States since the 1970s must be directly traceable to a corresponding simple increase in calorie consumption or perhaps very specific shifts in macronutrient intake. We often hear narratives focusing on culprits like rising sugar intake or maybe the increased consumption of vegetable oils as the primary drivers of this major societal change. This narrative, while compelling and easy to digest, is frequently supported by very simple correlations drawn between food supply data and obesity rates, or sometimes just relying on isolated anecdotal observations. However, when we perform a careful and methodologically detailed review of the actual evidence, including looking closely at recent large-scale studies, and crucially, paying attention to necessary methodological critiques, the picture that emerges is far more complex, nuanced, and frankly, challenging to those simple narratives. One of the most essential concepts we must grapple with immediately is the distinction between correlation and causation. It is incredibly tempting and quite common in nutritional epidemiology to look at a graph and attribute the rise in obesity directly to whatever dietary factor happens to closely parallel the obesity rate line on that graph. Whether that visually correlating factor is vegetable oils, total calories, or sugar, the temptation is strong to declare it the cause. But this is where we need to apply significant critical thinking. If we were to rely on nothing more than the observation that two different lines on a graph are moving together over time, we could just as easily conclude something completely absurd, yet statistically correlated. For instance, a classic, albeit morbid, example highlights this danger. The data show that eating more cheese tracks closely with the statistics of people dying from getting entangled in their bed sheets while sleeping. This kind of spurious association is common, misleading, and powerfully highlights the fundamental principle that correlation does not establish causation. It underscores why we must scrutinize the reliability and quality of the underlying data before we dare to draw any definitive conclusions about what is driving the obesity epidemic. The key takeaway here is straightforward but profound. Correlation between any observed dietary trend and the rise of obesity simply does not establish a causal link. Before any policy recommendations or personal dietary changes are made, we absolutely must insist on detailed analysis supported by high-quality data. Now, let us consider the primary source of dietary intake data in the United States, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Analyses drawn from the data collected by that survey have been very widely cited over the years to support the contention that the average calorie intake among Americans has increased steadily over time, especially spanning the 1970s up through the early 2000s. For example, among Mexican-American adults, specific analysis of data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey showed that the mean energy intake reportedly rose from 1,983 kilocalories between 1982 and 1984 to 2,186 kilocalories between 1999 and 2006. Significant increases in reported intake were documented for both men and women within this specific population group. Interestingly, during this very same period, the macronutrient composition of the reported diet shifted. Specifically, the percentage of calories derived from total fat and from saturated fat decreased, which was consistent with public health recommendations at the time encouraging Americans to reduce their overall fat intake. Concurrently, the reported carbohydrate intake increased, while protein intake, when measured as a percentage of total calories, experienced only a slight decline. These observed trends in macronutrient shifts generally mirrored what was being reported across the general United States population. However, here is the critical paradox. Despite these clear changes in reported dietary composition specifically, lower reported fat and higher reported carbohydrate intake, the prevalence of obesity and diabetes increased substantially, not just among Mexican American adults, but across the broader United States population as a whole. This outcome strongly suggests a vital point. Simple macronutrient composition is not by itself the sole or primary driver of the sweeping obesity trends we have witnessed. The evidence indicates that the causes are truly multifactorial. This includes total energy intake, yes, but also physical activity levels, the complexity of the modern food environment, biological factors, and, significantly, the pervasive issue of underreporting in the data itself. The shifts toward lower fat and higher carbohydrate content in the diet have demonstrably failed to prevent the rise in obesity, emphasizing that the causes are not explained by the manipulation of any single nutrient. The complexity of the epidemic demands that we do not oversimplify the causes of obesity. This brings us to the most vital point concerning dietary surveillance data: its inherent validity, or lack thereof. We must interpret these findings from that survey and any conclusions drawn from self-reported data with extreme caution. Decades of methodological research have definitively demonstrated that self-reported dietary intake data, which forms the basis of surveys like the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, are subject to substantial and systematic underreporting. This bias is particularly acute among individuals who are categorized as overweight or obese. In fact, after this one, I will devote an entire episode to the issue of underreporting food intake. To grasp the severity of this issue, consider analyses that compare a person's reported energy intake to what would be physiologically plausible or necessary merely for survival and basic metabolic maintenance. These analyses reveal a stunning conclusion. The majority of respondents in United States nutrition surveys report calorie intakes that are far too low to actually sustain their basic metabolic needs. Let me offer some specific figures that highlight the scale of this misreporting. Across nearly 40 years of data collection in the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, a staggering 67% of women and 59% of men reported energy intakes that were determined to be physically implausible. Furthermore, the extent of this underreporting bias increases sharply, almost predictably, as the body mass index, or BMI, of the respondent increases. Among adults classified as obese, the average daily underreporting was found to exceed 700 to 850 kilocalories per day, sometimes amounting to 40% of their estimated daily energy needs. Therefore, one of the key takeaways we must internalize is that self-reported dietary intake data systematically and substantially underestimate actual calorie consumption, especially in people with overweight or obesity. The trends we see in reported calorie intake, which seem to show an increase, may not be reflecting real behavioral changes in what Americans are actually eating. To complicate matters further, the interpretation of these trends is heavily influenced by changes in the survey methodology over time. As researchers improve their techniques, the way data is collected changes, and this can introduce artificial increases in the reported calorie intake that have nothing to do with people actually eating more food. For example, improvements in interview techniques, or the decision to include more weekend days in the survey capture period, have been shown to artificially inflate the reported calorie intake. The implication here is that a large portion of the apparent increase in average calorie intake that we see documented in national nutrition surveys may be entirely explained by these methodological changes, rather than reflecting genuine shifts in national consumption behavior. It is not just about raw quantity. There is also the problem of selective misreporting. Self-reported food surveys are highly vulnerable to people selectively reporting inaccurate information. Specifically, people are particularly likely to underreport the consumption of foods that they perceive as unhealthy, such as foods high in fat or high in sugar. This tendency to selectively misreport has actually grown as public awareness regarding dietary health risks has increased over the decades. The consequence is that any apparent trends we observe in macronutrient intake, such as the reported decrease in fat consumption, may actually be reflecting shifting patterns of honesty or social desirability bias, that is, people reporting what they think they should be eating, rather than what they truly consumed. This bias makes it incredibly difficult to accurately track genuine dietary changes over time. There is yet another layer of complexity that confounds our ability to track true trends over decades. The process of converting the data collected from food recall surveys into concrete nutrient intake estimates relies heavily on food composition databases. These databases themselves have undergone changes over time and may not consistently or accurately reflect the true nutrient content of all foods being consumed, particularly those consumed outside the home or originating from complex commercial sources. This inherent reliance on evolving and potentially imperfect databases further complicates our efforts to track true long-term trends in energy and specific nutrient intake across decades. Given these deep methodological challenges, we must conclude that the rise in obesity simply cannot be explained by relying on simple trends derived from self-reported calorie or macronutrient intake. The data are hopelessly confounded by the issues of systematic underreporting and by necessary, yet distorting, methodological changes within the surveys themselves. Therefore, the prudent and scientifically sound approach demands that we do not assume that simple trends in self-reported calorie or macronutrient intake are the explanation for the rise in obesity. We must not rely on simple visual correlations between various dietary factors and the sweeping obesity rates, remembering that correlation does not establish causation and spurious associations are tragically common. We must recognize the severe limitations of dietary surveillance data, acknowledging that most self-reported intake data are not physiologically plausible, especially in people with obesity. Instead, the recommendation from high-quality research is clear. We must pivot our focus toward objective measures and seek out high-quality research. Where feasible and appropriate, researchers should use studies that validate dietary intake through objective biological markers or through advanced techniques like doubly labeled water to obtain reliable data. Furthermore, it is essential that we do not oversimplify the complex causes contributing to obesity. The epidemic is unquestionably multifactorial, involving intricate interactions among dietary behaviors, physical activity levels, the broader food and physical environment, and complex biological and genetic factors. While much of this discussion focuses on macronutrients and calories, it is important to briefly touch upon trends in micronutrient intake, which also inform our understanding of overall dietary quality. Recent comprehensive analyses of data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, spanning 2003 through 2018, reveal a persistent problem. Despite decades of public health guidance and general awareness, United States adults continue to significantly underconsume key micronutrients. This list includes vitamins A, C, D, E, and K, as well as essential minerals such as calcium, potassium, magnesium, and choline. This inadequacy persists even when the intake from dietary supplements is included in the calculations. Conversely, sodium consumption remains consistently overconsumed across the population. While some marginal progress has been noted for specific nutrients, overall nutrient intake and the percentage of the population meeting key recommendations have changed very little over the last 15 years. This highlights a troubling plateau in improving dietary quality. It is worth noting the increasingly significant role of dietary supplements in the modern American diet. Supplements now provide a substantial share of the intake for several important vitamins and minerals. The use of dietary supplements has actually increased over time in the United States. Between 2007 and 2018, the prevalence of using any dietary supplement among United States adults climbed from 54% to 61%. This increase was particularly notable among men, among non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic adults, and among individuals categorized in lower income brackets. During this period, there was a specific increase in the use of single nutrient supplements such as vitamin D, magnesium, or vitamin B12, while the use of general multivitamin mineral products experienced a slight decline. Among children, supplement use generally remained stable, with the exception of an increase observed specifically among children facing food insecurity. Despite this increased reliance on supplements, a vital point remains. We cannot assume that this growing supplement use has solved the problem of nutrient inadequacy. Even with supplements, many adults do not meet recommended intakes for several key micronutrients. Data confirms that most United States adults still fail to meet the recommended intakes for several key micronutrients, and consequently, the overall dietary quality of the nation remains suboptimal. This means that we should not assume that increased supplement use has solved the problem of nutrient inadequacy. In summarizing the immense challenges associated with interpreting dietary data and the obesity epidemic, we must reinforce the primary conclusions drawn from detailed analyses. First, we must exercise caution when interpreting dietary surveillance data and when forming public health recommendations. The available self-reported data is highly flawed. Second, we cannot allow the rise in obesity to be superficially explained by relying on simplistic trends in self-reported calorie consumption or macronutrient shifts. Third, the pervasive issues of substantial underreporting, which is especially acute among individuals with obesity, coupled with the distorting influence of methodological changes in survey design, means that the reported trends are highly unreliable indicators of true change. Fourth, we must recognize that persistent micronutrient shortfalls continue to exist across the population, even with increased supplement use. Fifth, the complex and devastating nature of the obesity epidemic demands that we approach it as a phenomenon rooted in multifactorial causes, requiring sophisticated research and caution against embracing any singular dietary culprit based on flimsy correlational evidence. To move forward effectively, researchers and policymakers must recognize the limitations inherent in self-reported intake data and prioritize high-quality research that can objectively measure consumption and behavior. The rise in obesity cannot be explained by simple trends in self-reported calorie or macronutrient intake. Underreporting, methodological changes, persistent micronutrient shortfalls, and multifactorial causes demand caution in interpreting dietary surveillance data and forming public health recommendations. Only then can we hope to untangle the true complex dynamics driving the enduring challenge of the United States obesity epidemic. Thank you for joining me today.